Welcome to today's show. We have our guest, Daivd, and we're going to be talking about the millennial generation and their failure to launch in today's economy, and also about the modern education system as well. Is it an asset to that generation, or is it a burden, or what can we do as a civilization to help this generation move forward and to help them achieve these milestones, i.e. moving out, buying their first house, buying their first car? Or should we look down upon them for the failure to achieve these milestones? Or do we look at the very economic facts in the situation they live in? It is simply not possible for them to even live up to the baby boomer standards of if one looks at the baby boomers, what they went through in the 70s, it was possible for them to graduate college without debt. It was possible for them to own a house in their mid-20s. Such possibilities, such economic milestones are a simple impossibility to the millennial. So from your perspective, Daivd, how do you really look at, since you have been part of education, what's your viewpoint on that?
There have been pretty dramatic changes in our society from the time that I was 20
Yep.
and the time my children were 20.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few things that I think sit as a backdrop to this. The whole workplace has been changing, given the changes in technology and what have you. So that's a big factor. There's also, in part because of these changes, I think there's less confidence about what the future's going to look like.
Yes.
And what the possibilities really are.
I mean, the old blueprints: graduate high school,
Yeah.
get a college degree, get a job. That job will look after you. You can retire. The government will pay your pension, but as we know, that's not going to happen.
Well, it's a question, at least at this point, whether any pattern like that is going to be sustainable. And of course, combined with it is a concern about ecology, a concern about whether the way of life that we have built in a industrial and post-industrial world, whether that is actually sustainable.
Yes.
So, I know that my children, many in my children's generation, those are all factors in how they think about things. Now, when I think about my own life, I can find an interesting parallel here.
Okay.
And the parallel is nuclear war.
All right, go on.
When I was a child, there was, we invented the bomb.
Yep.
The Americans are the only ones to use it. They dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then we invented the hydrogen bomb. And we developed a lot of propaganda around it, a lot of talk about it. And there was the Cold War and the fear that the Soviet Union and the Americans would square off. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis around this whole issue.
Anyone who's ever been to a communist nation knows communism falls apart underneath its own weight. Like, it's self-evident if you've ever been to a communist nation.
Yeah, but maybe capitalism does too. I mean, capitalism hasn't been all that successful in a number of places either. So some places it's been successful, others it hasn't. I have seen one empire dissolve in my lifetime, and that was based in Moscow. And I would not be at all surprised if I see another one dissolve in my lifetime, and that one's based in Washington. I don't think these two economic models both have their profound limitations and their profound struggles. And certainly Bolshevism was not very elastic in figuring what to do with those struggles. But the kind of capitalism we have too is also brings with it tremendous problems, and those are going to have to be sorted out as well if it's going to survive. But let me just finish this. That kind of shudder to your sense of the future that my generation had, some scholars say has led to a number of things. They say it's led, for example, to the failure of my generation to be able to make lifelong commitments.
I mean, I believe the baby boomers have the highest divorce rates.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so the argument is that they're entered into the psyche of my generation a uneasiness about the future because of that.
Yes.
So, but what was still there in my generation, and even in people in my generation who developed a certain amount of social criticism, even in my generation who took exception to capitalism, for example, and exception to consumerism, people who were involved in the struggle around race and around the Vietnam War and what have you. It is remarkable how many people in my generation are driving BMWs.
Yep.
It is remarkable. And the degree to which they did buy this dream that you talked about, the house, the car, and what have you, and in the end, become as successful or more than their parents. Now, I've taught in universities for a long time now, and pay some attention to my children's generation. And I haven't done any study of this, so I don't know what the scene really looks like factually, although I've read a few things about it. What's interesting to me is the number of young people who simply aren't interested in owning a car, aren't interested in necessarily owning a house. They maybe want some stable living environment, aren't interested in acquiring a whole bunch of stuff.
Yes.
And some of the people that have been talking about this, writing about it, have suggested that that's why we have Uber. That's why we have these new methods of sharing things instead of everybody owning one. I don't know if that's really true or not, but it would appear that something like that is taking place. At the same time, I'm struck. Again, I can't statistically say anything about this because I don't know, but I am very struck by the generation of my children and those a bit younger than my children as well. I am very struck by their commitments to friendship.
Okay.
They're very committed to friendship. And they're also very committed to doing things together.
Yep.
Like actively doing things together. And very interested in not just their own lives, but the lives of people less fortunate in our society, and what makes good sense as a life of service. Good sense is a life of service. They're not utopian about it. My generation was very utopian. That's why those aspirations dissolved. This next generation, I don't know, but I am struck by how many of them are not utopian, but have a different set of things that really concern them. So and now is this related to the failure to launch? This is an interesting term, and of course it does refer to certain kids having to live with their parents for an extended period of time and things of that nature. Maybe these are intimately tied up with each other. I'm not sure.
Being materialistic is not really a possibility anymore for the younger generation. They may desire to have the nice car. They may desire to have a nice house. They may desire to have a big wardrobe, but it's out of their reach. So maybe as a consequence, they're more social.
Well, if that's the case, there's a big part of me that says that's good.
Oh, okay.
Because I think that kind of consumer-oriented life isn't worth living. So for me, the big question is, how can I live with less? How can I do with less? And how can I cultivate some of the gifts and skills that I see in my children? I mentioned friendship. They're so much better at friendship than I am.
Really?
And my life would be much better if I had been much better at friendship.
Yeah. And that's another thing, and there's also the minimalist concept, where a person learns to control their spending, get their debt under control, have no debt, live a more modest lifestyle for the freedom that gives. Because as soon as you're heavily in debt, I mean, you're more or less a slave to the corporation, because you have to work to pay off the mortgage, you have to work to pay off the credit card debts. So by being a minimalist, you're more or less freed from being a corporate slave. I mean, is it really worth the rat race?
Well, we have in liberal democratic societies had a tax system which was intended to address some of those issues a bit. We haven't addressed them very well at all. But I recall the monk, the American monk, Thomas Merton, wonderful writer. I remember he was interviewed by a journalist on one occasion, and the journalist made some comment about all the sacrifices made to become a monk. And Merton laughed and said, what are you talking about? Look at our life here in Kentucky. You know, he lived at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky. And he said, we grow our own food.
Self-sufficiency?
We eat extremely well all the time. We have time for study and reading. We have time for prayer. We live together. We drink wine at every meal. Do you want to understand somebody who makes sacrifice? Let me tell you who makes sacrifices. He said to the journalist, go to New York City and follow young executives for one day. There you will see sacrifice. Because what do they give up? They give up all their time, most all their space, and they're living a rat race based on an abstract idea. It is so unsensual, so uninfleshed, and with so little pleasure in it. So my sense is that the young people that are making these choices, that there is something going on there that ought to be encouraged. And the simpler life is coming to greet us anyways. It's good to see some people taking it on deliberately.
Very well said. And actually, even how much of it is going to be a choice and how much of it is going to happen anyways, with the millennial generation not being able to be massive consumers, who's going to buy the new car? Who's going to buy the new house?
So our economy is going to change.
It has to.
Yeah.
I mean, so will we evolve into some kind of hippie state? That's the question. But also the question is,
I think everybody in Edmonton having a garden would be an improvement.
However, another topic that should be addressed, if we are honest with ourselves about employment, how many jobs right now are absolutely necessary? Like, how many people are actually employed and that employment creates value? Now, I'm not saying from a very basic point of view, technically all we need are farmers and people to build shelter. No, I'm talking about people who are employed in every aspect of life. How much employment is just made up jobs? Like, it's like a joke with middle management or the HR department. So, you know, like there's jokes like there's some jobs that we could probably do without. Or it's another joke with some government employees, like, what do you actually do?
Well, I think Derek, that what you're pointing to here has to do with what I would call the question of scale.
Scale, good.
We have the industrial world, when we came through the industrial period, that is a new kind of society.
Yes.
A new kind of complexity. There are many complex things about farming and a rural life and hunting and gathering as well. There's a whole different kind of knowledge there. But those are not complex societies.
Nope.
Industrial society becomes very complex, and our society is building on that, is a very complex society. And then there's the issue of how do you accomplish everything that is necessary? How do you monitor and check on its accomplishment? What are the rights of everybody in all of this? So you end up, the more complex or the larger any kind of body gets, any kind of organization gets, the larger it gets, I think then the more this question you're asking is reasonable. My own sense, I mean, I worked for a period of time for a large corporation, and then I worked for a lot of my life in universities and museums, government agencies ostensibly. And it seems to me that the issues of efficiency and of making judgments around those issues are not, there is no difference between government and corporations.
Okay.
The difference is size.
Yep.
If your government bureaucracy is at a particular kind of size and the corporate bureaucracy is at a particular kind of size, they both have the same problems. Because you can't, it's hard to make judgments about what's necessary and what isn't necessary. So my sense is that it's so much easier to say something about that when you have a smaller organization.
Yep.
A family business has a very discrete size, and you can make judgments and adjustments about it. It's pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Whereas large corporations, I'm sure large corporations have just as much, participate just as much in the 20% does it all and the 80% benefits as governments.
Yep.
Because of the size. So these are questions of scale, I think, more than they're questions of anything else. And my own sense is that, I mean, I'm kind of partial to at least thinking about how a somewhat simpler life would actually be in some ways much better. We would have richer relationships, we would know each other better, we would be able to participate in the sources of our life more. Is that nostalgic? Well, I don't know, maybe it is, but I certainly think that from a human point of view, there is a certain scale that is human. And often our societies have become so complicated, these scales are no longer human.
Yep. And actually that triggered a memory. Like I remember on my grandfather's farm, it's a more natural life. I mean, some months you work very, very hard. Other months, you don't. And it's like, they don't frat about it. You know, here in the industrial or in modern civilization, you kind of putz at work. You try to look busy, you try to spread out your work throughout the day. Well, but with farming, you know, you've got a lot of work to do. Just do as fast as you can, take the rest of the day off. And you just don't feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah, it's a different rhythm to life.
You know, it's...
And what I would say, coming back to the central theme we were talking about around the millennials, my sense is at least some of them are experimenting with that.
Yep.
They're experimenting with not working so much. They're experimenting with where their real joy lies.
Yes.
And with the commitments that they have. And so in that sense, it reminds me a little bit more of the 12th century.
Yep.
In that, in the 12th century, along with the Black Plague and a bunch of other stuff, you had ecological crisis and what have you, we had a bunch of people experiment with a different kind of life, and they were called monastics. They created monastic communities which were based on a much more direct relationship to the sources of your life and a much deeper commitment to the brothers and sisters with which you were living with, and a much greater capacity to be of service to those who weren't in your immediate monastic community. And I see young people doing something similar. The immediate sphere of friendship, the life of service, and the interest in being closer to the sources of your life. We'll see.
Well said. Think you need to go?